But you don't think they also can make introductions?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
No.
See eyes or any dismissal like that. Right. Maybe.
Good, we got quit answering.
I used to represent
Big relief.
Redraft now.
Somewhat.
I'm Tim Cross. Yeah. I sort of replaced John. Great.
So sorry.
But I think John's doing fine. Yeah, the other.
Data scientist is his sexiest job.
Real quickly.
We're trying to grab something. How are you?
It's mine.
I did not bring any this morning. There's a pair. If you want to say there.
Oh, there, okay. Yeah.
I've got the co-operator guy in the back.
His name is John Hudson Hollister.
Oh, great. Oh, so
I cried for 3 days.
Yeah.
People ask me, like, what was the percentage?
You ought to get We're really not even in the room.
You start something.
Okay, we're going to get started. So I invite you to come in and take your seats. You have a number of seats up here in the front. I know some people are still coming in.
As you come in, we have reports in the back.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm the Director of the Center for Data Innovation. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, where we're going to be discussing the future of open government data in the United States. Today's event is being sponsored by both the Center for Data Innovation and the Data Coalition. Before we begin, just a few logistics. First, today's event is being recorded. It's also being webcast, so welcome to those of you who are watching us online. If you'd like to follow along on the conversation on Twitter, we're going to be using the hashtag OpenGovData throughout this event, so you're welcome to join us there and share your comments. Now, if you follow me on Twitter, or if you follow the Center for Data Innovation on Twitter, you'll know at least two things. First, the Center for Data Innovation has been the preeminent advocate for comprehensive federal open data legislation. And so we're really thrilled to be here today in this moment. And second, today's event with legislation that we're going to be talking about here today, it's really a historic moment. I mean, if you look back at the legislative history of e-government, that history is actually quite short. The kind of modern era really started 20 years ago with the Clinger-Cohen Act, which said, basically, look, there's this thing called information technology. The government needs to get a lot smarter about how we use it. So it did things like create a government-wide enterprise architecture. It said that we're going to have federal CIOs. And it said we should be making strategic IT investments to make government more efficient. And then 6 years later, we had the E-Government Act, which basically said, look, there's this thing called the internet. Seems pretty important. We should get smarter about using that too. And so it did things like running the use of online government services, developing information security practices, and establishing government IT, cross-government IT leadership. So today, we're basically in this new moment where we need legislation that says, hey, look, there's this thing called data. It's really important, and we need to start being smarter about how we use it. And so we should be doing things like creating enterprise data inventories, releasing data in machine-readable open formats, and harmonizing data practices across the federal government. And it's not that some of these things don't already happen today, but it's important that we have legislation that really institutionalizes these types of processes within the federal government, just as we did with IT, and just as we did with kind of an online e-government. So fortunately, we've had some very thoughtful members of Congress and their staff who have been working incredibly hard over the past year to take these ideas and translate them into bipartisan legislation. So we are delighted to have 3 co-sponsors of the Open Government Data Act here with us today. First, we're going to be hearing from Representative Derek Kilmer of Washington's 6th Congressional District, then Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii, and finally, Representative Blake Farenthold of the 27th District of Texas. Each of them are very distinguished members of Congress. They are champions of an efficient and effective government, and they are visionaries for how data, technology, and innovation can be used to unlock enormous value in both the public and private sector. So please join me in welcoming each of them today. Representative Kilmer. Thanks.
Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming. It's good to be here. And my background was working in economic development before I got to Congress, and I worked for the Economic Development Board in Tacoma, Washington, and we had a sign up on the wall of our office that said, "We are competing with everyone, everywhere, every day, forever," which I always found slightly intimidating. But I think it's actually a pretty good ethic. Not just for folks who do local economic development, but for our country as well. And the reality is, in the 21st century, our country has competitors that want to eat our lunch. And I think our economy can't afford to have a dysfunctional government, and it doesn't simply need a functional government, it needs an effective government too. And I think that's what the possibility that's held here by discussion today. This discussion is about opening up a new era for government, an era where government can be more responsive to the needs of everyday Americans. And I guess I want to talk a little bit about the role of embracing big and open data in doing that. Think about the smartphone in your pocket. Before leaving for work, I will check my weather app to see whether I need an umbrella, to see how hot it's going to be. And all that weather data powering that app comes from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency. So that's just one example of how government data can affect our everyday lives. It can also lead to new ventures, new economic opportunities. Verona Solutions is an example of that. Verona Solutions is a company that came up with one of the most popular apps used by surfers. They also use NOAA data. The buoy and tide data from NOAA has been captured and put into an app to know where the big waves are going to hit. And Verona Solutions is now more successful as a consequence of the ability to harness government data. I'll give you a couple other examples. I represent more military veterans than any Democrat in the United States House. And we saw a VA scandal in 2014 where wait times were manipulated. It was a big shock to everybody. And that capacity to harness open data would provide for an agency like the VA to be more efficient, to have a performance dashboard, to also protect personal records while doing that. It can also help Americans better understand how our agencies work. The Department of Education is looking at using performance data to have a college scorecard so everyone can compare schools and look at how institutions are or are not providing bang for the buck. I'll mention one other thing on this front. Right now you have a number of, one of the primary consumers for the work we're doing are federal agencies. The ability to have data shared among agencies to collect, because right now you have agencies that are often collecting the same information. And if you can coordinate the better use of that data and make sure data is going to the right places, you can avoid that duplication. And that's important because it can save taxpayer money. So it's why we got this moving, and I really want to thank my colleagues for their partnership on this. We're almost ready to drop an open data bill. Also want to thank the stakeholders who were involved with that and all of our staffs, including Aaron Wasserman from my team, who put in a bunch of time on this. The bill is going to build on President Obama's open data policy for the federal government. Data.gov would host an enterprise data inventory that government offices and that the public would have access to. It would be in an open format, an easily searchable format by default. safe and reasonable processes would be established to determine what information would be available to the public. But I think this really empowers and encourages positive changes by every agency, from the head of the agency all the way down to the to individual employees. So again, I want to thank my colleagues. The Open Government Data Act is going to, I think, empower government to be more effective. It's going to empower the private sector to innovate. It's going to empower citizens to participate. And I think all of our colleagues should be able to get behind that. Thanks, everybody.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you to my two colleagues in the U.S. House for their great work. And I also want to thank everybody here for your commitment to this issue. You know, the political incentives in Washington, D.C., I think encourage, both on the media side, in the electoral ecosystem, and the legislative ecosystem, encourage us to not work on stuff like this. Encourage us to find areas where there can be fierce disagreement, where we can empower the most inflamed among us in order to cause us to not work together, to make government less and less functional over time. And this is, in my view, the perfect antidote to that. So I really want to thank especially the staff for working so hard, and the organizations that have dedicated really their professional lives to this. You know, we don't always agree on everything, but this is about accountability, efficiency, and innovation. And I'm really excited to build on President Obama's executive order that made clear that government data has to be accessible to the public. It's our data, and it has to be in a usable format. So this legislation builds on the executive order and hopefully will continue to be momentum. So in my view, this legislation is about achieving 4 objectives. The first thing is that I think citizens, companies, institutions that interact with the government ought to be able to have a basic expectation that whatever interactions you may have to have with the federal, state, or county government, that it should be as painless, as expeditious, and as efficient as possible. It shouldn't be on the individual interacting with the government to figure out which websites to log into, which forms. It's the digital equivalent of filling out everything in triplicate. So it is true that we have digitized a lot of our processes. It is not true, however, that we have streamlined a lot of our processes or rationalized a lot of our processes. A lot of them are processes from decades ago that are simply now in digital format, slightly faster, but almost just as cumbersome. So it would be no small thing to do what other governments in Europe have done, which allows you to go to one portal, do everything that you need to do to interact with the government, and let the government on the back end figure out which agency needs which data. The second thing that this does, and I think this is one of the reasons that that we've been able to get bipartisan support for this measure, is it increases transparency and accountability. And my view is that as long as there are no national security or privacy restrictions under the statute, the government data should be made available in an open and readable digital format. And I think that not everybody totally understands. I was talking to my brother who was visiting last night about this legislation. He said, well, isn't all that information already available? And my answer is, theoretically. It's like when I asked for an update from my State Department of Transportation one time about a particular project, and they gave me 300 pages worth of data, and I was to figure out where the answer to my question was. The idea is that, sure, all of this, either under FOIA or under other statutes, is theoretically available to the public, but it is not meaningfully available to the public. And so if we want an efficient government, especially if we want an accountable government, we have to make this machine-readable, open, and interoperable. Excuse me, technical experts, if those are the wrong words. But that's conceptually, that's what we're really trying to accomplish. And third, decision support within agencies, policy support within agencies. I think this is a sort of non-trivial aspect of this legislation, and that is that even within government agencies, and certainly between executive branch agencies, they're not necessarily sharing data with each other. So HUD doesn't have DOT data, DOT doesn't have DOE data, and so on. And to get that decision support, I think will allow us to just make smarter decisions across the board. You can imagine that if your job is rather narrow, that sure you'd like additional data, but you're not in any kind of position to figure out how to get databases to talk to each other and how to access information from different executive agencies, or even to figure out what else might be available. And so getting all of these data sets to be basically in the same place eventually, I think is going to help our government to actually make good choices. This is the public's information, but it's not necessarily public information until we can access it in the way that we want to in the digital world. And finally, I thought in terms of preparing my remarks about giving you examples of how this is going to unleash innovation in the private sector. But the truth is, sure, we can all imagine examples, and there are some current examples. And Representative Kilmer talked about one that's near and dear to my heart, which is accurate surf reports. But the truth is, we're not exactly sure what sector of the economy is most going to benefit. We're not exactly sure what innovation is going to occur. But if all of our collective instincts are correct, this is going to be very exciting for the private sector. There is so much information that real estate decision makers, energy investors, education innovators, people who want to create apps, things for fun, things that are a little more serious, things for planners. It is literally endless to imagine all of this information which the public is entitled to being essentially in the same place and allowing us to have access to it as it becomes available. I think it's very exciting for the private sector. I do want to acknowledge Senator Sass, who wasn't able to come here this morning, but who is a supporter of this legislation. Ben and I are friends. I think it's fair to say that I'm among the most progressive members of the Senate, and I think it is a certainty that Ben Sass is among the most conservative members of the Senate. And we have found our common ground on this piece of legislation because everybody understands the need to make government work better for the people and for the economy. So I'm pleased to play a role in this. I want to acknowledge all of the staff and the organizations that are making this happen. Thanks very much.
So I'm Congressman Blake Farenthold. I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse to go last because all the good stuff that you already had prepared, somebody else has already said. But I do want to echo what the senator pointed out. This is the public's data. It's been bought and paid for with our tax dollars, and we need to have an efficient way to get it out. And we have no clue who's going to find the next breakthrough of how to use this to create a better, more efficient government or to make money in the private sector off of this data. We can't, in this pace technology is going, we can't predict what the next best thing is going to be. Not I'd be sitting in my tropical paradise billion-dollar resort if I could always predict what the next big thing was. I'd be making a lot of money investing. But what I am here to do, and what I think my colleagues are here to do, is to make sure that we get full value for what the federal government has done. And that is making that information available across government lines, making that information available to the public. I think it's going to make a lot of money. I think it's going to save lives. And I think it's just going to be a good thing all the way around. Obviously, not all government information needs to get out there. Intelligence information, we're protecting the information that needs to be protected, the information about people's privacy. We don't want veterans' medical records made public, but we probably want the call response times and some of the metrics with respect to how our veterans are treated at the VA made public so the VA can be held accountable, so the private sector can say, hey, I've got an application that can solve your scheduling problems. There are all sorts of opportunities in here just by making this information available. And you go back and stuff used to be kept in the National Archives, still is, used to be kept in libraries. We're bringing this up to the digital age where you don't have to come to the National Archives to find it. You don't have to go to the courthouse to get the information. It's there, available to you in an accessible format that you can use in your home, in your office, in machine-readable form. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to do it prospectively so it doesn't cost a lot of money. If people want to put the old stuff on, more power to them. I think we're going to get some value out of that. But this is 21st century government. It's open and transparent. It's bipartisan. It's bicameral. We're going to really get some cool stuff out of it, and I'm looking forward to seeing it.
Thank you all for those remarks. It's clear we have an excellent team here that's going to be available to usher this legislation through. We're looking forward to seeing it progress. So please join me again in thanking these members for being here today. Now I'd like to introduce Hudson Hollister, who's the Executive Director of the Data Coalition. We'll be introducing our next panelist and moderating that discussion.
I'm grateful for the sign that shows my name. I'd like to invite our panelists for the discussion to come up. And if you found it, bring your table tent with you so you can be identified. Good morning, everybody. I'm Hudson Hollister. I'm the Executive Director of the Data Coalition. Our organization is the only open data trade association supported by our 32 corporate members. We challenge the government to standardize and to publish its information. We spent the first couple of years of our existence advocating for the passage of the first open data law, the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, or DATA Act. That law is the nation's mandate for open data and spending. We've spent much of our energy over the past couple of years advocating for the Financial Transparency Act, which will bring open data across financial regulation. And today we are excited to enthusiastically endorse the Open Government Data Act. Now, by contrast with the other mandates that our trade association has pursued in the past, the Open Government Data Act is a mandate to bring open data across everything, all of the information that the government collects and generates. One of the issues that I'm excited to dig into with our panel is how a broad mandate to standardize and to publish everything that the government maintains, how does that fit with the domain-specific work that we've been doing in the trenches to bring spending and to bring financial regulation into the world of open? But in order to bring that discussion out and in order to really dig into the benefits of open data across all these different constituencies, I am excited to introduce our panel. I'll start with the far left. Kat Duffy is the director of Sunlight Labs. Next to her, Tim Day is the brand new vice president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Center for Innovative Technology there. Jed Sunwall is the head of open data for Amazon. And Joshua New is a policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation, our host today. I'm excited to have them all, and we're going to move right into the discussion. I'd like to ask each of you to start by introducing yourself, explaining the constituency you represent, and giving us some idea of what the Open Government Data Act means for that constituency. Fire away, Kat.
All right. Well, thank you, Hudson. Yes, so the Sunlight Foundation is a nonpartisan NGO. We've been around for about 10 years, and we focus on making government more transparent and more accountable to the public. And in Sunlight Labs in particular, we build technological tools to help further that goal, and also to help inform the technological discussions behind this issue. We work very frequently with journalists, with policy advocates, with academics, and then also just with the American public in general. And we do that in part by having open source, openly available APIs and data sets that the public can access. A good example of that is openstates.org, which is a one unified API that anyone can hit, and they can find basically at a moment's notice the bill text of any bill, for example, that is going to any state legislature across the country. So it's a good way of sort of crossing over the federalist silos and bringing all that information into one place. In terms of this bill, I mean, there is some like magic language for us, right, in this bill. At the very beginning, the statement that the federal government has the responsibility to be transparent and accountable to its citizens, that could be our mission statement. We couldn't agree more. And, you know, hopefully that is not an idea that needs to be codified. Hopefully that is an idea that is simply inherent in the fabric of our country. Another statement that the American people are the owners of federal government data. That's a really important point to make. It is true. It is absolutely true. This data has been paid for, been funded by taxpayers, and it should be returned to the American public. And I think at times it is helpful to remind government workers and to remind government institutions that that is the case. Because it is very easy, and I say this as a former federal employee, it is very easy to begin thinking of it as your data, right? Your agency's data, your organization's data, and this is the public's data. And I think the presumption of openness, the presumption of open data that we see in this bill is also an important point, because it puts the onus on the federal government to explain why the public shouldn't have access to its own data, as opposed to having to explain why the public should have access to its own data. So we are thrilled to see this. We really applaud the leadership of the senators and representatives who have sponsored it, and we are looking forward to being part of discussions as this progresses to see how we can get this through and make it as strong as possible.
Thank you, Kat. We move from the nonprofit advocacy sector to the for-profit sector in the U.S. Chamber. Tim, fire away.
Good morning. Thank you, Hudson, and thank you for having us today. U.S. Chamber, as most of you know, is the world's largest business federation, representing over 3 million companies of every size in every sector in every region of the world. The Center for Advanced Technology and Innovation, of which I am part of at the Chamber, is a recently developed new initiative in the Chamber to begin looking at the role of technology in the economy and to advocate for rational policy that will promote, create jobs, promote innovation, of which I think the Open Government Data Act is a perfect example of, for all the reasons that we've heard already. Data is the fuel for the economy, and it's becoming very important to not only true tech companies, but companies that perhaps Caterpillar, John Deere, and others are seeing themselves more as a technology data company than a manufacturing company. And so for those reasons, we are looking at the Chamber of bridging that gap between the end user and the users of technology and starting to tell that story in a very cohesive and meaningful way. And we look forward to becoming more involved in not only the Open Government Data Act, but the Financial Transparency Act and a lot of other initiatives that have been introduced and promoting this kind of technology. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. And Amazon Web Services is one of the leaders in cloud technology and web applications. What does the Open Government Data Act mean for you?
Okay. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me here. And I do want to thank the representatives, Kilmer and Farenthold and Senator Hatz on behalf of Amazon for supporting this bill. For us, we have over 1 million customers worldwide that use Amazon Web Services to build news, web applications, and all sorts of services that are enabled by cloud computing. And from our perspective, the availability of data and open data is kind of like oxygen in the atmosphere for our platform and for our customers. And we've seen it time and time again. We have many customers whose products would not exist without the availability of open data. I see some of our customers in this room that they have entire businesses that have been built upon the availability of open data. So for us, it's very important that more data be made available. And because of that, we're very happy about this bill. And particularly the presumption that data should be open. If not, if we don't have otherwise an excuse to keep it closed, which is obviously perfectly valid. And then on the other hand, so I run our open data programs at Amazon. We also work with a lot of public sector customers who they know they have mission critical objectives that rely on producing and sharing their own data more effectively, either within their agency or with other agencies. And we foresee that this bill is going to help unlock a lot of collaboration just among government itself and a lot of efficiency within agencies themselves.
Thanks. Fire away, Joshua. It's on.
Okay, cool. There's no light, I was confused. So the Center for Data Innovation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy think tank focusing on data technology and public policy. And of all the issues that we work on that are considerably more exciting on the surface than open government data, like the Internet of Things, autonomous decision making, genomic precision medicine, open data is definitely the least exciting on the surface, but it's probably one of the most important issues that we work on. And this is an issue that we've been focusing on since our inception about 3 years ago now. And we put out a report in 2015 called a Data Innovation Agenda for Congress that laid out about a dozen, kind of what we thought were mature legislative ideas of what Congress can do realistically to advance data innovation. And passing comprehensive open data legislation to codify the administration's open data publication requirements was issue number one. We thought this was like the most important thing that Congress could do to secure the future of open data in the United States. And there are a lot of reasons why this should be a law. It should be, officially codified in U.S. code, as opposed to just maintaining open data requirements through administrative actions, through executive orders. And one of the most pressing ones is that we run a meetup group called the Open Data Leaders, where we bring in federal chief data officers, leaders in open data in the federal government, and then members of the open data community that want to interact, they want to exchange ideas, they want to learn about specific data sets that they can use to build their business, to fuel their journalism tools, to fuel their research. And what we found from those discussions is that pretty much everyone agrees that open data is good, but not everyone really understands how important it is. And without a strong mandate from Congress to say, you have to publish this data, it's the people's data, it has to be open by default, not everyone will commit to it fully. They won't necessarily invest or devote as much attention to it as it needs to. They won't really kind of reorient their operations around open data, around how to better manage their own data for their own mission delivery. And then they don't really understand how it can fully serve the public. So this is a really important bill that we're very happy to introduce today to this is officially where we can say the United States is full steam ahead on open data, because now we have the groundwork that is here forever.
Let's talk about one of the biggest challenges that the Open Government Data Act will face should it be signed into law by President Obama. That is the contrast between the specific and the general. Many of you have worked very hard on specific areas of government information. I know Kat has invested a lot of energy in opening up foreign agent registrations. Tim spent years campaigning for the Data Act to open up spending information. Jed has focused on the information that's available from sensors maintained by the government, on trying to turn that into open data. And Josh has written about a range of issues, including financial regulatory filings. In each of those cases, we need specific change at specific agencies, but here we've got a broad general mandate. Starting with Kat, how can a broad and necessarily general mandate solve the domain-specific challenges that you work with?
Sure. So I will actually start by reading the definition of machine-readable that is in the draft legislation, right? The term machine-readable means information or data that is in a format that can be easily processed by a computer without human intervention while ensuring no semantic meaning is lost. So let's take that definition. The Department of Justice has a responsibility to disclose foreign agent registration acts. That is to say, essentially, lobbyists for foreign countries. Okay. What happens? The way that DOJ discloses that, they have a website where they put this information out. The information is put out as an individual PDF. That PDF has a handwritten registration code on it, which means that it is a document that is printed out, and then someone handwrites on it, and then someone else scans it back into the system. And then eventually that scan is uploaded, and that is disclosure. That is also, by definition under this act, machine readable. No semantic meaning has actually been lost there. You can see everything that is contained in that document. It has been easily processed by a computer. It's been PDF'd, it's there, it's available. And it doesn't really require human intervention other than the actual process of scanning it, right? So that complies with the letter of the law in terms of machine readable. But it is so difficult to then actually use that information and to use that data. And people who work in this area spend hours, so many hours, I can't describe it, clicking through PDF after PDF after PDF. And if you go on the Department of Justice's website, there is no way to, there's no way that DOJ has put this information together in a form that is aggregated. So you can look at, for example, one registrant's name, and then you can see all of the PDFs that are associated with that registrant. But none of that data is aggregated or collated in any usable way that allows it to be visible to you at a glance. At Sunlight, we have a website called Foreign Influence Explorer. And one of the things that we do is we scrape the information that comes out of these foreign agent registration disclosures. We scrape it, we clean it, we structure it, and we put it back out to the world in a way that we think is more useful. And so you can go and you can click on a registrant and you can see their disbursements. You can see what they've been paid to do what, who all of their clients are at a glance. You can click over to the PDF if you want to see it. You can also see if they are connected to domestic lobbying through FEC disclosures and FCC disclosures. We've been doing this for years. We have thrown so many resources at it. We've thrown army of interns who are hand entering data. We have thrown new code trying to make our scraping better. And at the end of the day, we really can't, as an NGO in particular, we don't have the resources to continue throwing technology at this problem. We need DOJ to put this out in a way that is simpler and easier to use. All of the information is public. It belongs to the public. It's all there. And this would make everyone at DOJ's life easier too. There's no reason to be paying a federal employee to print the thing out, handwrite something on it, scan it back in, upload it, when everyone who was involved in that process could all be looking at the same data at the same time. And so those are the kinds of concrete examples that we would hope, as this goes through committee and everything else, we would really like to be engaging at the very granular human level about what this means and how we use this broad mandate to clarify and to make more robust the concept of data standards and the concept of machine readable in this format.
Perhaps a committee language in a report saying that a scan PDF is not consistent with the definition. That kind of thing might help.
That kind of thing might help.
Maybe we can work on that together.
Absolutely. I think there's all sorts of things that can help, but there's so much room for discussion and there's so much room for understanding and for growth and education in this area that I think we're thrilled to have a bill like this because that creates the possibility for those discussions. And that's great.
Tim, same question for you. This contrast between the general and the specific.
Well, as you mentioned, Hudson, years ago, we started working on the Data Act. And it was what I felt at the time, and I still do, obviously, that it was great innovative thinking and pushing forward the government's ability to use data more effectively in the financial ways. And I think it's something that has been interesting in that I think the education has started. And when we started the Data Act, lobbying on the Hill and messaging within the administration, I didn't see a lot of excitement like what we had on our side lobbying the issue. And it was over time, though, we kept going back and continuing the education. And I think the same for this. So it's broad, it's written broadly, but I think that's to our benefit in some respect in that we have the ability to start telling the stories, to start informing members of Congress and the administration on the benefits of what data can do, as we've all heard today. I think, in addition, I think there are ways that at the Chamber we're going to be starting to look at, again, connecting the dots, telling the stories of how this benefits the consumer and constituents and taxpayers in the country. And so I think while it's broad in that it's going to give us more opportunity to explain, there are some ways that I think that we can perhaps start to define areas perhaps for social good and looking at ways to benefit the poor communities and looking at ways that it can help benefit, maybe healthcare perhaps, and looking at ways to make those connections to people to have a clear understanding of that. So I do see some similarities to the Data Act. There's been a great amount of work on the Data Act and foundation has been provided for us now to build on and to go forward.
Jed, what impact will this broad mandate have on specific data sets that you care about?
Okay, yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, the broad mandate, it's concerning in some ways because there's just so much stuff out there that when people seek out to do these enterprise data inventories, it's going to be sort of bottomless. There's so much stuff that agencies are producing, and as they start uncovering new data sets that they have, they're going to find others and others, and it can seem kind of endless. So the approach that we take, when we look at public data sets, so our program, one of the things we do is we actually will host and make available certain data sets at our expense for our customers. And we've been doing that a lot with sensor data and genomic data that's really large. And so these are large data sets that exist. A lot of people know they're out there in the world, but nobody can access them because very few people have like the wherewithal to get them, to like download terabytes or petabytes of data or otherwise just acquire the data. So we solved that issue by making it available in the cloud. Now, the way that we look at those data sets is by looking at sort of what is the customer demand, and we work backwards from the customer to figure out like how to prioritize those things. And what I foresee happening is that agencies and organizations are going to be doing these enterprise data inventories and trying to take stock of everything that they have. And then very quickly, and probably simultaneously, I think, they'll want to identify what are the data sets that really actually help us accomplish our mission, which are the ones that we really need to focus on, and which ones should we be, is there a real opportunity cost for us not like getting these things open and out to the public as soon as possible. And then I can also speak from experience that, inevitably, key data sets that are really valuable, they're going to be valuable to a lot of different constituencies, and there's going to be no way to make them available in precisely the way that everybody wants them. And so there's going to be a lot of compromise and sort of general disappointment, but I think that's kind of, most people in Washington understand how to live in that sort of environment.
It's terrible.
Yeah. But it ends up being complex. And so one thing that I end up saying a lot when I get to talk to government customers about this sort of thing is, really try to focus on, again, identify the data that, of all the data you have, try to figure out what's most mission critical. And when you're opening it up and making it available to people, I think one of the things the government really has to offer is authenticity and like validity. So this data is accurate, we can vouch for it, and here it is raw. I think making data available in raw formats, especially in open standards, in open formats, but making it available raw is really an easy and quick way to start making data open and useful.
Josh, what are your thoughts on the general versus specific tension that we're all discussing here?
So I want to echo some of the points that I think everyone agreed on. Is that there are myriad specific kind of niche areas where you do need specific standards, you do need specific guidance on how to publish particular data sets depending on our use cases. But this is kind of like the cornerstone from where we can go to have that discussion about how do we actually figure out the next steps. And the fact that we're at the point with this bill that we can start talking about that is like a kind of a landmark thing in open data. We've seen the challenges of what happens when you get too specific with data standards. Legislating specific data formats can cause a lot of problems, and I'll talk about that later, I guess, because it's something that I know you care about quite a bit. But so I think starting broad and then getting specific is definitely the right approach, and I don't think it would benefit the open data community to try to tackle all those small but very important problems to start with.
Thanks very much. And we will get into specific standards later on. Just to quickly front this, there's going to be a DUNS number discussion. So those of you who care about that, get excited. But I'm not going to ask about that yet. This is how we have a panel, an interesting panel. I want to first ask about data inventories. As you all know, because you've all read the bill, Section 7 of the Open Government Data Act requires every agency to create and to maintain an inventory of every data set. That is a big job, but it's not an unfamiliar job because President Obama issued his open data policy in 2013 requiring that very thing. We have about 3 years of experience with data inventories, and so I want to start with Kat, come down the line, and ask whether, given what we know about these data inventories that have been required by executive order for 3 years, what's good about them, what's bad about them, what will codifying this actually change?
Well, I would hope that by sort of putting a timeline on it and codifying it, we are able to start tracking progress against it. I think it actually empowers agencies to be able to do that. I think any sort of again putting on my former federal employee hat here. I think any agency that receives this mandate and receives it as unfunded is going to be terrified, right? This is an expensive endeavor. This is very hard to do, and you need people who really understand how to do it involved in the process. Putting this kind of thing together is a different skill set than your sort of traditional information management approach. And so I think we would also want to think through the level of investment, the level of sunk funds that we should be putting into infrastructure, for example, and putting into the creation of these repositories to make sure that when it's done well and in a way that can move everyone forward. The other sort of point I would make here is that right now the bill says that the chief information officer of each agency may make the enterprise data inventory available to other agencies or the public. And in the same way that information that the federal government is collecting or using, there should be a presumption of openness and a presumption that it belongs to the public. I think we would argue that the same applies to metadata, and that we should presume that large repositories and metadata, there should probably be a presumption of openness there, because it's very useful to see the world of information or the world of data that's being housed in one agency over another.
In fact, someone has threatened litigation against the White House over that very point.
Yes. But so in a very specific example, if you look at food and water safety, right? Food and water information is contained in the EPA. It's housed at the USDA. It's housed in any number of different institutions, and it really creates a barrier to entry for the public to understand how to even ask for data, how to even seek it out, if you can't see who has it and where it is and how. And so I think ideally we would love to see enterprise data inventories being created in a way where they could actually be compared to each other, and they could be structured against each other to allow for a more comprehensive and umbrella approach to looking at the data housing of the federal government writ large.
Tim, does the U.S. Chamber of Commerce love data inventories, hate data inventories, or indifferent?
At the moment, indifferent, I think, but leaning towards supporting. And I think, the government is famous for resisting change. And we've learned that from our work on the Data Act. And I think, again, not to belabor that point, but we did learn a lot from that effort. And I think we have to have some sort of a mandate for the government, like what we have in the Open Government Data Act, to force change. And that's not going to be easy. It's going to be difficult. We've learned a lot along the way, and I think we'll continue to learn as we move forward with this legislation. But I think ultimately, when we start to see what can be done with inventories and looking at ways to analyze the data and the benefits that come from data analytics and predictive analytics, it's going to change everything. I mean, it's going to change the way we're currently working with the government, and the taxpayers will see a true benefit. And I think, that's where we're going to have to continue to work and have the grassroots efforts in place across the country to force and to continue to look at these opportunities. But absolutely, I think data inventories are a necessary element of this legislation, and I'm glad to see that it was included.
Jed, is Amazon already making use of the inventories that are being published under the executive order, and what do you see happening in the future?
We've looked at them. I'm optimistic about them. I do have a concern that they can be seen as a boondoggle. And to echo what Kat said, a lot of people freak out because these things can be expensive. Certainly for some agencies. But I'm glad that they're in the bill and that it's required here, because there's a lot of stuff that we just don't know. People don't know that it's out there. Like I said before, there are a lot of agencies, they don't understand what data their own agency has. And so I think that this exercise, as agencies go through it, I hope they do, they'll learn a lot and be better because of it. I want to call out a guy named Maxim Pechersky. He's the Chief Data Officer of San Diego, and he's actually written a really good guide based on his experience running the creating open data or the enterprise data inventory for San Diego. And somewhere in there he summarizes, he's just like, somehow I held, I don't know how many meetings, 30-something meetings with all these heads of departments, bugging them, asking them about all the kind of data they had and what format was in, everything like that. And nobody hated him at the end of it. He was really proud of that accomplishment. Because it's hard. It is going to be a lot of hard work going after all the different departments and all the different programs and figuring out what they have and making sense out of it. But I think it's a very worthwhile exercise for the agencies themselves, let alone the public.
Joshua, will the Center for Data Innovation inventory the inventories?
So I just want to, again, echo what all you guys have said, and a big shout out to Sunlight, who's been done a lot of great work on trying to encourage publication of these enterprise data inventories over the years. What's interesting is that agencies are already supposed to have been doing this. So under M1313, that OMB guidance that defines open data policy that was released in 2013, agencies are basically supposed to create two catalogs. One of their public data repository, the list of all their public data assets, and their enterprise data inventory, just everything they have. And so enterprise data inventory was private, the public data inventory was public. And then some people in government, I'd like to also give a shout out to Dan Morgan, who's the chief data officer at the Department of Transportation. He was the first to basically say, why is this enterprise data inventory not public information? It should be. We don't have to expose any personal information. We shouldn't. We can do this responsibly. But how is this any different than the general data that we're supposed to make open and publicly available? So DOT published that ahead of new rules from OMB that this also has to be public. But I know Sunlight has a tracker. I know data.gov has a tracker. Since those new rules, very few agencies have actually delivered this. And I think that goes to show how important this requirement is just for agencies to actually understand what data they even have. Because if they already had these kind of lists and knew all the assets they had under their control, this wouldn't be an issue. But the fact that it is reveals like they don't know what data they have for the most part. They don't even know how they can use it. And once they can actually catalog it, that's the first step of actually, avoiding duplicitous data collection, avoiding collecting a data set that a different agency has, not thinking they have information that they do have at their disposal, and just better delivering their mission because they can actually understand what they're capable of doing. And so, of course, the enterprise data inventories are great for public, for businesses that want to know what data sets are coming down the pipe. But it's really important to stress just how good this will be for agency performance itself, just so they can actually know what they have in-house.
Let's shift to talk about data standards, which can be a very dry topic, but can also be a very exciting one. I've spent the last 8 years of my life on it, and I know when it gets exciting. We're going to make it exciting. I want to ask this question to the whole panel, whoever wants to jump in. Section 5 of the Open Government Data Act. It sets machine-readable and open as the default for everything. It's really the meat of this bill. I think you agree. Section 5 says that agencies are supposed to publish all of their information as machine-readable data, which means easily processed by a computer. And it also says that agencies, when they do this, they have to use open formats. That means formats that are freely available for everybody to use and not proprietary. Does anybody have examples of data formats in use now that are proprietary, that are owned by somebody? And what do you think this bill would change? Anybody? Joshua.
Sure. So this is a kind of the perfect example you could have about why open format is important. So when a contractor, somebody does business with the government, they apply and are granted what's called the DUNS number. It's a unique identifier developed by a company called Dun & Bradstreet, and it basically acts like a social security number to keep track of this entity is receiving this much funding from the government. The use of unique identifiers is really important. It helps the government manage their resources better, allows taxpayers to understand where that money's going. The concept is great. However, in the federal acquisition regulation, and this is particularly bizarre, is that it specifically requires a use of the DUNS number. There are plenty of other open data standards. There are plenty being developed that could serve the same exact function that are open formats. However, the DUNS number is a privately owned format. You have to apply for a license to use it. And when that license expires, you no longer have access to that data. Much like if you had a license to use a piece of computer software, that license expired, you can no longer use it. That's written in the Code of Federal Regulations that you have to use a DUNS number. And so an example of why this causes problems is that the government used DUNS numbers to track stimulus spending. And they had a great tool where you could go in and see where the money was going, to what state, to what projects. It was great for accountability and just having a more engaged democracy. You could understand what the government's doing with your taxpayer dollars. However, not too long ago, that license expired. And the government would have had to pay several $1 billion to redo it. They didn't think it was worth it, and that data is no longer available to the public because it was not using an open format.
And the Open Government Data Act requires GSA to immediately stop using the DUNS number. What will it do?
So the Code of Federal Regulations, if I understand it correctly, responds to rules established in the U.S. Code and basically it's like operating procedures for agencies to adhere to the law. There are existing efforts. A couple months ago, DoD, NASA, and GSA proposed an amendment to the federal acquisition regulation to replace, basically strike all specific requirements to use DUNS numbers with just use an open format. So that's still ongoing, but having the US code say you need to use an open format is basically would be a very, very strong signal that the Code of Federal Regulations has to be updated to reflect that. I'm not sure what window that would take place in, but yes, that would change it.
So it's significant in areas far beyond the world of transparency and data innovation. This law might change a lot of established procedure, you're saying. Anybody else on the panel, any other examples of formats that are proprietary that this law might change?
I think it has less to do with, I think maybe it's, thinking about it in terms of formats limits you to the sort of the current formats that are being used, right? And sort of Joshua, to your point, in the virtue of a bill like this and keeping it expansive is that you want to keep enough breadth in it that it remains current, right, moving forward, and doesn't get outdated, and technology will easily outpace legislation. So instead of thinking of it specifically in terms of formats, it might be more constructive to think of it as anything that is tied to a specific company's software. If it is tied to a specific company's software, then you can think of it as not sort of being optimally open. So there is, if you're putting out a spreadsheet in the most recent version of, Microsoft Excel, that is less useful to many people than if you're putting it out as like a CSV file, which is readable in many different, through many different types of software and is a more sort of universally acceptable format. PDFs are technically, they are widely used and they are easy for people to look at, but they are technically not completely open. They are still proprietary to Adobe, and you need Adobe software to use them in their optimal format. So I think, again, it would just be the virtue of this bill and the virtue of being able to then work through this process is being able to have those discussions and being able to think through what we mean and what we need to be looking forward to in the future to make sure that the public has as much access to this as possible.
I'm going to do two more questions, and then I'm going to call it open to the audience. I'm about to ask the second to last question, but the last question, I want to give the panelists a warning. It's going to be a lightning round. The last question, I'm going to ask you for a single sentence on what you would change in this bill if you had the opportunity. So, be thinking about in one sentence what you would change, but that's not what I'm asking now. Before that, I want to ask about politics. So, yeah, sorry, two hard questions to end the thing. Where do you expect the support for this broad reform will be? Where do you expect the opposition will be? And I'll start with Kat to come down toward me. Support and opposition, what are the prospects?
But I keep getting started with it because I'm at the end of the table.
That's true, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it feels like the direction should go the other way.
We want sunlight to set the agenda and industry to respond. How about that?
I suspect that you will see. I suspect you will see opposition in terms of whether or not this is funded, right? How expensive it will be, the capacity that people have to take it on. I suspect you will also see opposition in terms of national security, in terms of mosaic effect. What happens if people can suddenly see all of the data that's actually out there in public, but put it all together? What danger does that create? I have spent many years working with sensitive data. I am personally sympathetic to that concern, but again, the importance of the presumption of openness in this bill is that is not an obstacle to open data. That is simply a question that needs to be addressed, and it can be addressed. But one of the ways that it's addressed is by investing in a strong enough digital infrastructure to be able to put the data, to collect the data and put it out in ways that allow for handling those sensitivities.
I agree, Kat, and I think, part of the responsibility is, again, telling that story and making sure people are aware. I think the scariness of Big Brother government, perhaps, in not knowing the details of how this can be handled appropriately, probably will cause concern with a lot of different audiences out there. But again, I think once people start to understand that there are safeguards and there are firewalls in place that will protect data that needs to be protected, that's a good thing, and we'll continue to move forward. And it's not unlike anything that we've already heard in the data activities that we did for 7 years or so. And I think there's a good education in place from which we can continue to build from. So I think, obviously today you've seen from the, bipartisan members of Congress, I think we've got a great ability to work with the various caucuses that have been established focused on tech and starting there and educating them on the benefits of the legislation, and hopefully working with your group and others as we move forward here to show that there is a diverse background of industry and associations that support the legislation and the benefits that will come as a result of it.
So yeah, I want to echo the idea that, their opposition will come in the form of sort of feet dragging by agencies on some of the work. But from an industry standpoint, certainly there are industries and sectors that benefit from barriers to accessing data, or they benefit from having proprietary access or privileged access to data. They certainly might feel threatened by this. But of course, the support is going to come from what I would believe is a much broader coalition of businesses and industries, entrepreneurs and students, researchers globally that will benefit from this and will actually expand the economy based on the availability of this data.
Joshua, support and opposition. And then after that, I'm going to ask for a single sentence from everybody.
This was framed as bipartisan, and then we talked about this on the phone, that it's almost more appropriate to call this nonpartisan. There's so many pieces of open data that benefit everyone from radical transparency people, not that it's not like radical, it's a good thing, to the very pro,
point of pride.
the very pro business-minded people, that this is ultimately a tremendous benefit for people doing business with the government, for people using open data to build their own products, to people interested in starting their own company based on open data. It's a tremendous public resource that will lower the barrier to entry for a lot of these industries. And it's great for government oversight. It's great for cracking down on wasteful spending. So yeah, I'm a big fan of open data. I think this bill will be widely supported. And I agree with all the concerns that you mentioned, and I wanted to figure out the specific line in the bill to point out to you. I can't find it right now. But there are exemptions, as Kevin sure you know. So in terms of exposing potentially sensitive information or data that could have a public safety risk or national security concern, that is in the U.S. Code already exempted in certain cases. And this bill would acknowledge is that this is not in any way superseding those requirements. The defense community has very unique rules about how they have to publish information that this does not change. The OMB does have a mosaic effect review process. So I agree we need to continue to make sure that we do that well, but I don't think that will be, I don't think that should give people much pause in terms of supporting this piece of legislation.
I would respond to that quickly by just saying, certainly the mosaic effect language is in the bill. In my experience, that does not prevent people from opposing it on those grounds anyway. And in particular, if you're looking for buy-in within the federal government and looking for buy-in among federal employees in terms of getting them to really get behind this process, federal employees need to understand the data that they work in and day out and the sensitivities of it, that it is being protected. So federal employees often need more reassurance than they are given in terms of how this data will be collected and used, because usually the people who are asking for the data can't actually explain where it will be housed, how it will be used, who will see it, nor can they inspire confidence that what they're saying is actually how it will pan out.
All right. If this bill continues to move through the legislative process, there will be a hearing in the House Oversight Committee, and there will be a hearing in the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. Suppose that committee were listening to you, but they were only listening for a minute, like members of Congress tend to do, and you only had one sentence to give them. It looks like you all are ready. Nobody's scribbling. Kat, what's the one sentence you would give them?
I would say this is wonderful, but we don't only need a presumption of openness and a push towards innovation in terms of the data that government collects, but also in terms of the process of governance, and that includes Congress as well.
Tim, what's your one sentence?
One sentence would be to obviously ask for their support of the legislation, and I think the other part of it would be to perhaps suggest shortening the enactment time frame from 180 days to maybe perhaps 60 days. That's Tim Day's opinion, but I think there's enough time that people have been able to learn and understand what's about to happen, and I think time is already too short anyway, and we need to move the ball quicker.
Let's diagram that one.
It's more than one sentence.
Jed, fire away.
Infrastructure matters. There shouldn't be a surprise coming from me. That's my sentence. Data.
2 words.
The data, I think a lot of the assumptions in a lot of open data discussions in this bill come from a place where data is like tabular data or regulatory data. But again, as we discussed before, I focus a lot on sensor data. Government's producing so much data, they're producing so much more, the volumes are growing tremendously. And sharing that and opening that effectively really requires great infrastructure. And so just something to keep in mind as we move forward, because the future's already here.
Now, when I called for one sentence, I meant that you could say the sentence.
I had to explain the sentence, just 2 words. So.
All right, Joshua, what's your one sentence?
So the American people, the public, businesses need to guarantee that this data will be here forever, and this bill would do that. And then we can start to tackle the problems that were addressed today that do deserve to be addressed. And this is how we start.
All right, I'm going to try my best to be equitable with audience questions. Everybody ask controversial ones. Yes, in the back. And please identify yourself and shout for the microphones.
Hey, I'm Jack Newell. I write for FCW. I was wondering if you could talk about the time frame here. We obviously have a presidential transition coming up, and depending on who's elected and how the candidates affect down-party votes, I mean, we could really see a huge shift in the composition of Washington. So does this kind of need to get through as quickly as possible before Obama's out of office in order to sustain this momentum? How does this affect future administrations and future Congresses?
For the sake of the webcast, I'm going to repeat the question.
It's picked up by the mic.
Oh, it's picked up? Great. We will not repeat the question. Anybody have thoughts?
So, of course, we would like this to move as quickly as possible, but I think should it not happen anytime soon, I'm confident that this, it could happen in the next Congress. We have bipartisan support in the House and Senate for it. The Data Act passed pretty overwhelmingly bipartisanly. It will happen soon. I just hope it's as soon as possible.
I agree completely. I think the Obama administration has been incredible in helping, with this initiative and others. I think, as we've heard again today, that this is a very bipartisan issue, and I think when you start to see the results and educating people on the benefits like jobs and creating startups and looking at ways to do things differently with data, I think that will be a message that will resonate well with pretty much anybody that's currently running. So I think it's incumbent upon us to continue that education process and making sure that they do understand the importance of open data.
I agree. I think that one of the virtues of this is that it removes it from being an administrative specific issue and turns it into the American people's issue, which it is. I would like to think that all of our elected officials could support a concept that makes government more efficient and that makes government more transparent and more accountable to citizens and gives the American people back things that they have already paid for.
Questions from the audience? Yes.
Yeah. Charlie Clark with Government Executive. So he said that the senator said that it will be dropped soon. So is there a holdup? Are they trying to get more co-sponsors? And are there some major name lawmakers that are going to attach themselves to it? Any intelligence?
What's happened?
Oh, yeah. So I believe the House bill, from my understanding, is coming before the Senate bill, but they are all on board. It's a matter of days from what I understand.
Senator Sass has signed on.
Yeah. As of recently.
I see a question there in the back. Identify yourself, if you would.
Yeah, I'm Nick Shotley from Spark. One of the types of government data that both Representative Kilmer and Senator Schatz mentioned, is research data, specifically the NOAA data was one of the examples that they used. And I'm really curious to get your thoughts on how this bill will interact with research data specifically. Sort of to that point, if it's going to cover externally funded research and the data that's generated from that, and also the data that might be generated by contractors that are working for the agencies but not necessarily government employees.
Very deferential panel
I can, if you want to give someone else a chance to talk.
Such a deferential panel.
Yeah. I don't have any great insight into that.
Yeah, I think the language in the draft legislation is so broad that I wouldn't
Right.
really want to presume to speak to exactly how it goes to those questions. I can say at least that at Sunlight, we think those are very important questions to be asking, and as this moves forward, we would love to be part of those discussions and be informing how this sort of thinks through those and addresses them.
And I think obviously the hearing process that Hudson mentioned will probably start to explore some of those issues as well.
And I'll say, speaking for the Data Coalition, if this bill were to become law, we would take it to NOAA and say, look, here's what the general law is. What's your plan for conforming to this broad mandate?
And also, on the issue of contractors, it's something we've written about a little bit before. It also speaks to the importance of open format. So if a contractor, unless that data is otherwise sensitive or it reveals critical aspects of their business model or their intellectual property, that data is the government's, and it should ask to use an open format. So when that contract expires, that resources is open for competition from other contractors. If you could use a format that only that company developed, that's called vendor lock-in. It happens in healthcare a lot, and it prevents competition. It raises prices. It reduces the value of the service. So yes, that data will be open, and that is an open format to let everyone access it as well.
Any other controversy from the audience? Alex Howard.
Sure. Alex Howard, Sunlight. There's a disconnect between data that's released as open data on data.gov and data that is requested through the Freedom of Information Act. The administration asked what high-value data sets were in 2009. Reading this legislation, I don't see that language. I don't see anything about the demand signal from industry. That is what as people may know, commercial requesters make up the bulk of FOIA requests. So to what extent should that be reflected in the language of the law? And to what extent should there be teeth about releasing data that is not heavily redacted, because the language of the law also includes nothing that would not be released under FOIA's restrictions.
Should there be a demand mechanism? Should there be a restriction on redaction?
I would agree. I mean, the demand idea is really important. I mean, I sort of hinted at this before talking about the inventories. I don't believe that merely knowing what's available is valuable. And so I think there is value in it, but that might not accomplish the results that I think that the bill is seeking to accomplish, which is increased economic activity and innovation. And so I do believe that there is benefit in having a focus or some way of driving agencies to determine which of their data sets are actually in demand.
I mean, I promise this wasn't a plan. It's weird to have a Sunlight person answer a Sunlight question. I admit this. But I think, on a broader point as well, and this sort of goes to when my one sentence, I said I hoped that we would be looking at a presumption of openness and using data to look at the process of governance in addition to the data that is housed inside government. Looking at things like demand drivers, right? That is data. The requests that have come in and how long they're, how long it takes to process them and the process that they go through and where they are in that process, that is all data, right? So process.
Would it be in the inventories?
So process is also data, and even the way that this bill currently thinks about reporting on the progress of the bill is not a terribly innovative approach, right? We could be using tech and existing platforms that already exist to put more accountability and transparency just into the process of compliance with this bill, as opposed to waiting for a year to get a report or 2 years to get a report from OMB and another year to get a report from the GAO. We could have dashboards that showed every agency's progress against this, for example. We could be asking in the data repositories, for example, and this bill goes to it a little bit. It's just very general language, so it's something we would want to drill down into. This bill does address sort of looking at, I think the platforms and the networks internal to agencies, as well as the actual data that agencies are collecting. But I think what we would really want to think about are more innovative ways to look at the process of how each agency is going about its work, and use data and use transparency and accountability to make that more effective and to make that more efficient and to make it easier for federal employees to do their jobs.
I think I see Oh, go ahead.
And I just, to the point, the bill does include language, and so when agencies shape their open data plans, they're required to consider and engage, open data users, businesses, members of the public, what have you, in how they use open data, which, and again, this is a general approach, but that will inform them about how their data is being used, why it's in demand, and that'll pave the way for things like, we see this already happening on a small scale today, like the Department of Health and Human Services has a pilot program, called demand-driven open data, which is where HHS has so much data they couldn't possibly afford to publish it all and still keep the lights on. So rather than just request a data set and then maybe you get it, maybe you don't, you submit a value proposition for a particular data set. Like, oh, I want to build an app and it uses this data set to do X, Y, and Z, and this is why it's great. And then that is how they determine how they prioritize their release schedule. And that is I think, a really important approach to open data, because it doesn't just set the metric of success as we published 100 data sets this month. It's we published data sets that generated this much value this month, and it could be 2. But if those 2 data sets generated more value than 100 just benign data sets, that's progress, and that's a really important way to kind of tackle the mountain of data that agencies have and are struggling to kick it out. So hopefully that kind of model could be standardized now.
And I'm sorry, I'm going to add one more point there too, which is, Joshua, you had said earlier, like this data will be there forever. This bill doesn't address data retention standards at all, or any requirement that data retention standards be fundamentally re-examined, given the increased ability now to house data and to release data for extended periods of time. Right? Data retention standards were overwhelmingly created when you had to think about how much paper could fit in a filing cabinet, which could fit in a warehouse in like a cave in West Virginia, right? We are no longer in that world. And so I would say as well, like right now, I think we have FCC data online. There's a 2-year retention period. By the time that the OMB came out with the report, the initial data would already not be required to be public anymore. So I would say as well that having a more robust inclusion of looking at data retention standards and how we examine that process would also be a positive inclusion here.
We'll do 2 more questions from the audience, and I see one from our friends in industry.
No, I'm Tim McCrossin from Senator Carper's office. Do you think that the open data dashboard that the administration has published is an effective tool for monitoring agency progress in implementing this type of legislation? Do you think that it will have to change to be more effective based on this legislation?
I feel like you're looking at me. So I think it's rather than looking to that specific platform, because I think it's hard to, without knowing exactly what this process would actually call for, right, and what those data repositories would have to look like, I think it's difficult to say whether that specific platform would be the best platform. I think it's more the larger concept that we now have ways where we can more publicly demonstrate progress towards a goal, and pushing for that also then I think creates some competition, frankly, among agencies. Nobody wants to be at the very bottom, right? Nobody wants to be farther behind than everyone else. And we have seen it in terms of data inventories and creating benchmarks. There is something surprisingly effective about just giving people something to compete against. Honestly, it's quite a simple concept, but we've actually seen it have power. So when you're doing a census of open data, for example, or you're doing benchmarks or giving people scorecards, one of the and people, organizations, states, whatever it might be, you do actually then see the subjects of those inventories up their game. And so I guess I would just say let's not limit how we examine expansion of data, how we examine innovation, to antiquated mechanisms of reporting, because that's what everyone understands, that it's the path of least resistance. If we can also apply tech and apply innovation to that process as well.
Let's go for one more audience question. Rebecca Williams in the back of the room, please.
Oh, my name is Rebecca Williams. I used to work at Sunlight, Data.gov, over the data policy, so I'm familiar with this work. I read Blake though, so I don't know if I'm asking questions was already addressed. But my question is, like, last question of the day, if this is the MVP of the data bill, like I heard a lot of ways it could be expanded at the end, like some sort of building up with FOIA, or structuring narrative information as data, everything as data. As it is written right now, from each panelist, what is your favorite part that is in there that you're like, thank God this is in there? Maybe it's all the same answer.
What is your favorite part of the bill? Great question. And let's not start with you, Kat. I'm sensitive to those concerns. Josh, putting you on the spot. Favorite part of the bill?
So to echo Hudson's comment, section 5. So open and machine readable by default is like it's almost a catchphrase now, but it is incredibly important. So if we just had that, you know, if everything else was cut but that, we could figure out everything else slowly. We could piece it back together. But the fact that this is an official responsibility.
GAO reports.
Sorry?
The GAO reports.
Kidding. That is probably the most important thing. It defines open data as a permanent responsibility of the government, and that is like the crucial step before we can do anything else. So, section 5.
Favorite part, Jed?
It is section 5. Section 5 is the best part. I do want to put, like I think Josh pointed out the part where it actually encourages agencies to think about innovative uses of the data. That's so critical, and I actually think that that's a metric that we're going to be wanting to focus on more over time. We saw this before when it was like, hey, open up high-value data sets, and people are like, here's some high-value data sets, and they put out, you know, as many things that they call data sets out as they could. I hope we really do start focusing on that part of Section 5, which is what are the innovative uses of this data, and I want agencies to be tracking those and paying attention to them and talking about it.
Tim, your favorite?
I'm boring, but section 5, I think it's consistent with the other pieces of legislation that we've seen, Data Act, financial transparency, et cetera. And I think that truly gets at the heart of what's going to be meaningful. Again, taxpayers and the citizens on seeing true results of this work and this initiative.
And Kat, favorite part of the bill?
So we do love section 5.
Section 5.
But I don't want to repeat what everyone said, so I will add to that then that, you know, it is the statement that this belongs to the American people, and that the federal government has a responsibility to be transparent and accountable to the public. That is not rocket science, but actually having it included, having it just stated, and the idea that it would be codified means that we can get beyond that question. And that is no longer taking up our bandwidth, right? And instead we're having discussions about how we make that happen, how that's actionable, how we do it. And it would be so nice to not have to be debating the virtues of open data anymore, and instead be discussing exactly how we do it. And I will close by saying, this may be hard to see, but my 4-year-old daughter drew me a picture this morning for my panel, and it says, open data, yay! And then has 2 stick figures with smiley faces and an otter. And I would just say,
That's going to be our new logo.
the fact that we would be codifying the concept of open data, yay, makes us at Sunlight very, very happy.
Well, we thank everybody for participating today. In a sense, it's surprising that what Kat's daughter understands, the world's largest and most sophisticated organization, doesn't quite understand yet. Until the Data Act passed 2 years ago, there was no way to take a particular federal contractor and search and see which accounts and which appropriations that money came from. The Data Act had to be passed so that Treasury and OMB would come up with a structure to make that possible. Even today, financial regulators like the SEC, they're still using PDF documents to collect all that information that could be searchable open data. That's why we need the Financial Transparency Act, and I'm grateful, as speaking for the Data Coalition, that Representatives Kilmer and Farenthold have both co-sponsored the Financial Transparency Act. But beyond spending and financial reg, there is a vast and diverse landscape of information in the federal government that has tremendous value, but only if it's unlocked through the open data transformation. Foreign agent registrations are still PDFs, which are proprietary and not searchable.
And handwritten.
And what?
Handwritten.
And written, handwritten. Handwriting's a problem. Contractor listings, those are still expressed using the DUNS number, which is proprietary. The landscape is too big for any one law. That's why the Data Coalition is thrilled to enthusiastically endorse the Open Government Data Act, and we thank all of you for being here. Now, to land the plane, I'd like to call back up Daniel Castro, the Director of the Center for Data Innovation.
Well, thank you all again, and thanks everyone for being here. I just want to make sure, since we've had such great discussion about the different sections, in case you missed it, in the back we do have the section by section of the bill. so make sure you grab a copy of that. I actually like section 9, so I can't. But anyway, thanks to everyone for being here. Please join me again. Thanks to the panel, and we look forward to working with everyone in this room who wants to be a stakeholder and seeing this move forward in ways we can improve it and continue to push forward. Thank you.
Hey, can I get a picture of your? Okay, so we do like.
Absolutely.
No, you guys are doing a partner for.